On the last podcast, we talked about some of the concerns and issues associated with looking at evidence-based treatment.
Right.
And today we're going to look at a specific example as it relates to obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right. And one of the things we said at the end of that previous talk was that when you start talking to patients about a gold standard, the best treatment for a particular disorder, you introduce the possibility of unintended consequences. Right. And that's what much of this article is about, the unintended consequences of giving a patient of giving a patient false hope, or of letting the patient know that this is the treatment of choice and it should work.
Right.
Okay? And we need to be, as therapists, need to be very careful. As therapists, we need to be careful of saying that, and as a patient or a client, you need to be careful when you're told that.
Right.
Okay. So there's warnings both ways.
Right. Yeah. There's a difference between a gold standard in an assessment and a gold standard in a treatment. Right. When it comes to the gold standard of assessment, certainly there are tools and strategies that we use to assess a particular condition or a particular problem that supersedes everything else.
Right.
That's better than anything else.
Sure. For example, we talk about testing somebody's intellectual abilities. Right. There are what we now know, and everybody in the field agrees, are really valid, reliable, gold standard type tests.
It doesn't mean that there's not limitations to them.
That's right. That's right. There still are. And then you can go on the internet and take a 10-minute IQ test. There's a big difference between those two.
Absolutely.
Something that's administered by a trained and experienced professional, versus something you take online.
Yeah.
Okay. Same with personality tests. You can do the colors test, or you can do the food preference tests, or whatever little silly tests there are to test personality. Or you can go into an office and take a thorough gold standard type of personality assessment.
Yeah. I think of it most often with when we think of assessing autism spectrum disorder.
That's right.
There are certain tests that are designed to assess that very specifically, and then there are questionnaires. There's a form that you can fill out that has 10 questions on it, and there's a big difference in the type of thing. So when
that's for assessment.
That's assessment.
That's right. And
that's
there
very
you can
different
have
with treatment.
Right, there you can have a gold standard. But be very careful when we apply that notion of a gold standard to treatment, because treatment is far more complicated.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So when we think about treatment, and this is just sort of a primer for some of the things we're going to be talking about, when we talk about treatment, the way that we approach it, and we'll go ahead and maybe have that disclaimer here, that not all treating professionals view things the same way that we do.
Right.
There are some who say, if you come and you do what I tell you to do what I'm encouraging you to do, you will get better. And if you don't, then you're not doing something right.
Right. You're placing the blame on the patient or the client.
Right. Because I'm the professional and I know
it can't be the strategy. It has to be the way you're doing it, or there has to be something wrong with you. And we don't disagree with that. I'm saying, okay, if this isn't working, then we need to go into another line of treatment altogether.
Right.
We need to go to other strategies.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Because the argument would be, if it's not working, we don't have to debate why it's not working.
Right.
And the way that we see it is, we don't have to blame the patient or any other,
or the therapist.
Right.
Nobody needs to be blamed. It's just that, okay, this didn't work, so we're going to move on to this one.
Right.
Okay. We need to find out what's going to work for each particular individual.
Right. So but when it comes to treatment, we approach things from a very eclectic perspective, and so we try to use whatever strategies and techniques any particular person that comes to see us may need.
Right.
So with some people we may do quasi psychoanalytic, and for others we may do cognitive behavioral therapy, and for others we may do behaviorism, and for others we may do more humanistic, and so it may vary depending on the person's presentation.
Right. Now, this particular article was written by Shayla Nicely, and she is a therapist, but she is also a person who has obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right.
So she's a therapist who treats people with obsessive compulsive disorder, and she has the disorder herself.
Right.
And there are two themes, two sort of organizing themes running through this article. One is unintended negative consequences, and the other is false hope.
Right.
Okay.
So, but let's start out with mentioning what OCD is, because I think that this is going to be an important factor as we talk about some of these things. Because
sure is.
OCD is not putting your keys in the same place every day.
Right.
OCD is not preferring the milk to be on the left side of the refrigerator as opposed to the right side of the refrigerator. That's not OCD. Okay, those are preferences. Those are routines.
Right.
Those are little strategies that we use to remember where we put our keys. But that's not OCD.
Right.
And people come in and they talk about that kind of stuff quite often. They'll say, "Oh, well, no, I have OCD because I have to make sure that I put my shoes in the same place, and they have to be lined up." No, that's not necessarily. That's probably not OCD, and certainly not necessarily OCD in any way.
Yeah. I alphabetize my spices. Okay.
He does.
But it's because I have so many of them that you can't go rooting around every time you want a spice. So if they're alphabetized, you have that smile.
No, I'm not.
You have that clinician's smirk. I call it a clinician smirk. Doesn't make me OCD.
Right.
Okay, it makes my life more convenient. I put my socks together and put them, or we put our ties together by color, or shirts together by color. Those are probably not symptoms of OCD.
Right. Probably not. Probably not.
Probably not.
But
No, we're talking about OCD.
OCD is impairing.
OCD is and it's a disorder.
Right.
It's not a disease.
And the issue with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is just that. It's a disorder. It causes dysfunction. And so what we're talking about with OCD is either, it doesn't have to be both, but either obsessions or compulsions. Obsessions are thoughts, recurring thoughts that are intrusive and won't go away, and you may use various strategies or various things that you try to do, but they just won't stop, and you just sort of ruminate. Many times people with obsessions appear to have tremendous memories. They look as though they know particular things extremely, extremely well. But that is primarily because it's all they think about.
That's right.
They're just
because they
thinking
go
about
over it and over it and over it and over it.
And so we think of that as either perseveration or rumination. They're just sticking to it, and they have a really difficult time shifting their attention away from it. Compulsions are the behaviors, and so many times compulsions are matched with obsessions. So if you're obsessed and overly concerned and worried about germs, your compulsive behavior is going to be to wash your hands, because that compulsive behavior is going to help relieve the obsession of being fearful of germs.
We went to a talk years ago. We went to a talk by Phil Kendall.
Yes.
At, I think it was at
Coping
Temple.
Cat.
And he said people use their compulsive behaviors to deal with their obsessions.
Right.
Okay, so OCD, they come together.
Right. Typically, yeah.
Yeah, compulsions are used to deal with your obsessions.
Sometimes we have obsessions and we haven't quite yet found a compulsion to match it and to help with it. And so that in that case you may have obsessions without compulsions. And many times we have compulsions without really knowing why. We don't necessarily have the uncomfortable drive of the obsession, but we have a compulsive behavior where we have to do certain things and we have to have certain routines. Again, the key feature here, though, is that they are impairing. They impair your functioning in some way, which usually means that they consume a tremendous amount of time.
And that's exactly what I was going to say, is that the issue here is impairment.
Right.
Alphabetizing my spices doesn't control my life.
Right.
Okay. But
You're not sitting here thinking,
no,
I wonder if somebody's messing with my spices.
Right. Or I have to rush right home and deal with my spices.
Right.
But people who have obsessive compulsive disorder do think that way. They are, I might not like doing something, but I can do it. People with OCD can't do it, and it affects their lives. And that's the impairment part.
Right.
It's also a disorder, not a disease.
Right.
So with a disorder, we look for treatments, not cures.
Right.
Okay. And so remember, this is obsessive compulsive disorder, as it is with depression, anxiety.
Right.
We have anxiety disorders. We have depressive disorders. We have attentional disorders. Yeah. So remember, these things that we deal with are not diseases. We don't cure them with surgery or anything else. We manage them.
Right. Which is a fantastic. Maybe that's another podcast idea is differentiating disease from disorder.
Right.
Because that's one of the issues that I have when we talk about alcoholism as a disease. we're not curing alcoholism.
No.
If a person is an alcoholic, then they are an alcoholic, and when we refer to them when they're clean and they've been sober for a decade, we say they are a recovering alcoholic.
They're in recovery.
We never refer to them as being cured, and so that's why it's not a disease.
Right.
So it's a bit of a misnomer when we say that the disease of alcoholism, because it's not a disease.
Right.
Diseases can be cured, or we seek a cure. With most mental illnesses, there is no cure.
That's right. So we can change the way the brain is working.
Right.
We can do that sometimes with medications.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of obsessive compulsive disorder, we can use the therapy that she uses is called ERP, which stands for Exposure and Response Prevention Therapy, ERP. So you expose the person to get them more accustomed to it, or you prevent triggers from occurring. So ERP. So you can change the way the brain functions.
Right.
You can't cure the disorder. You can't fix the brain.
Right.
You can change the way the brain functions. You can't fix the brain.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And we just think about reading, right? You start out your life, you're not being able to read. You figure out how to read. All right. So your brain adjusted to help you read. If you stop reading and you never look at another word again, you're going to start having some difficulty remembering how to read. And it's just a simple fact that that's the way that our brain works.
Right. So what we want the brain to do is to work in a less dysfunctional way.
Right.
Okay. Right now, when you have the disorder, your brain works in a certain way. You want it to work in a less dysfunctional way so that life is a little bit better.
Yeah.
Okay. But you're not going to fix. And that's what she means by don't raise false hope and be careful of negative consequences, negative unintended consequences by thinking that there is a cure.
Right.
Okay. Now there are some people who do stop having OCD.
Yeah.
Okay. They fall into three categories. One is if you have very early onset, like in children, and some therapist or parent manages it very successfully very early before it has a chance. You talked about their good memories because they keep going over and over. And that's what memory does. The more times you do something, the more likely it is that you're going to make a memory of that thing. And so people with OCD tend to perseverate. They tend to go over and over and over the same things. So they make these deep memories, very easy to access. But if you get it early, and by early I think we're probably talking younger than 8 or 10.
Early childhood.
Early childhood. If you deal with it with a successful ERP program, you can maybe nip it in the bud before it becomes a problem. The second group is people who are obsessed by just one thing.
Right.
Okay, you're obsessed with germs, or you're obsessed with illness, or you're obsessed with something. If you have only one thing, many people can deal with that single thing. And then the third is a person who uses ERP successfully, okay, and they never rely on their compulsions, okay. But she calls that she believes that's unrealistic. She said she thinks that's an unrealistic expectation that a person will successfully use ERP and never return to their compulsions. And she said it's unreasonable to think that that's going to happen.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. It's not reasonable to anticipate that or expect that because the way that I talk about it with patients is that when something is causing you discomfort, whether it's a thought or something in your environment, the thing that's going to make you feel the best is to get away from it.
Right. That's right.
All right. So if you're really distressed about a snake, and there's a snake in your room, you're going to feel the best when you get as far away from that snake as possible.
That's right.
That doesn't cure your anxiety about snakes. That just gets you away from the anxiety caused by the presence of that snake.
Right. That's right.
If you want to if you want to treat or resolve some of that anxiety associated with being in the presence of a snake, you have to stay there.
Right.
You have to stay there, and allow yourself to process through and deal with that anxiety.
That's what she means by exposure.
That's exposure.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what happens is that you may do a successful ERP program and you may learn to deal with that snake.
That's right.
It's going to always cause you some discomfort. It will always. I mean, even those of us who are not afraid of snakes, I'm not afraid of snakes in any way, but they will startle me, and I'm not going to just reach down and grab one. So there is some anxiety there. But if you have OCD, if you have a compulsive fear of it, and you successfully do ERP, and it provides a little bit of anxiety every time you see one.
Right.
As soon as you see one and you escape, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm just going to get out of here." As soon as you do that, and it relieves all of that anxiety,
right.
you are now reintroducing
That's right.
a much more effective strategy at resolving that anxiety than ERP ever
That's
could
right.
be.
And that's what you need to remember about OCD. People with OCD tend to see things as being dangerous.
Right.
I know people who have OCD. They tend to see things as being dangerous.
Right.
My daughter's absolutely terrified of frogs. We have a lot of frogs in Florida, and we have 3 frogs who live on our porch. Okay, they live up.
I went over
top.
to his house the other day, and on the front door, there was a frog. I swear it was like 4 inches long. It was a huge frog.
Right.
And I just stood there knocking on the door because I really wanted your daughter to come answer the door so that it'd be right there.
She would have absolutely had a cardiac arrest.
It was going to be exposure therapy.
No, and both daughters are absolutely terrified of frogs. That's a single obsession.
Right.
Okay. That's the kind of thing that you can do exposure therapy.
Right.
Now they've refused. I've tried all of their lives. I said, "Honey, we can do it." No, they want no part of it.
Right.
Okay. So they remain terrified of frogs because they see frogs as being dangerous.
Right.
When you consider something being dangerous, you become anxious.
Right.
Okay? And you're absolutely right. It's the anxiety that you're trying to treat with the compulsive behavior, whether it's escaping or however you deal with it. It's that reaction to what you see as being dangerous.
Right.
Okay. It's not the intrusive thought.
Right.
It's your reaction to the thought.
And if you just think about the way that the person with OCD describes it, it just doesn't feel right, is what they'll say, right? They have to put their spices in alphabetical order because it just feels right. It doesn't. They feel uneasy. They feel disquieted. They feel anxious. They feel unnerved when they're out of order. And so they have to put them back in order. And that's where you're different. You don't have that uneasiness associated
I'm
with
only uneasy when I can't find something.
Right.
Okay, so to prevent that, I put them in alphabetical order.
Right.
Okay, but I don't sit here. I'm not sitting here now thinking about my spices.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I'm only thinking about it when I'm trying to use them.
Right.
Okay.
So it's that uneasiness. It's that need for it to feel right that is what we're referred to as the anxiety.
That's right. And what you do is you get into what nicely calls the OCD loop, where you see the snake, you're anxious, you escape, and so you keep doing that same thing. Okay.
Because it feels good to escape.
That's right. That's how you relieve the anxiety.
Right.
Okay. So by escaping, by moving to another place, you relieve the anxiety. Right. That's what you're trying to do.
Right.
And so you use these compulsive behaviors to deal with the anxiety over your obsession about snakes or frogs or spices.
And this is the real challenge, and we're kind of venturing a little bit off course here, just a smidge, but this is the main issue with treating anxiety.
Right.
Is because avoiding always works better. Avoiding the anxiety, getting away from the anxiety is always better than any treatment that we could offer.
Right.
Avoiding that snake is much better than trying to take a Xanax when you're in front of a snake.
That's right.
It works faster and it's much more comprehensive.
Right.
And as long as you're away from it, it continues to last. You don't have to keep taking the Xanax.
Right. But every time you see one, you're going to be looping through that.
And every time you escape, it really reinforces the danger, and that's the complication.
Right.
That's the real dilemma. Right. Is that every time you use escape as the strategy, it makes it even more difficult not to escape the next time.
Right. But it's easy to get into unintended consequences because she talks about this as being a disorder,
Right.
and she says ERP is what most therapists use. Okay, but she says, and it's interesting, she uses the word perfectly many times in this article.
Right.
I was struck by how many times. Probably part of one's obsession is to be perfect.
Right.
Okay, so if you have a person with OCD, you have this tendency to perfectionism.
Right.
Parents talk about that when they bring children in, and they will say, "No, he's a perfectionist. He has to do everything perfectly." Well, that's part of the OCD. Okay. So when you say to a person with OCD, "This is the treatment," this ERP therapy. Nobody does it perfectly.
Right.
And she says that. Nobody. She said, I'm an ERP therapist and I don't do it perfectly. Right. And so you have to be very careful if you're a therapist not to let the person believe that if they do ERP and if they do it correctly, it's going to cure the problem.
Right.
It's not. Sometimes you're going to feel successful and sometimes you aren't going to feel successful. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So don't get into this, she calls it self-imposed shame.
Right.
That there's something wrong with you because ERP isn't working. It should, your understanding is this should work. If it doesn't, it's your fault.
Right.
Okay, that makes things actually worse. That's one of those unintended consequences.
Absolutely. Another thing that often happens with this, and this is, and she doesn't mention this specifically in the article, but just something else to consider, is that many times the thing with OCD, anxiety in general, is that it shifts and changes. And so while a person may be somewhat obsessive or compulsive over germs for a while, if they can go through an ERP program, but their obsession and compulsion could shift to something else.
Goes to something else.
And what's fascinating, I do think this is fascinating, is that sometimes what becomes the focus of their OCD is the treatment. And so they become obsessive and compulsive over the strategies used in the treatment. Right. And so now they feel compelled to perform a particular behavior associated with the treatment. And they feel a similar distress if they're unable to do that. Like people who get into exercise and they're like, no, I have to exercise because exercising relieves my anxiety. And they become extremely anxious if they don't get to exercise. Right. And so they exercise multiple times a day, or they exercise, they forsake other things with the, for the goal of exercising. Right. And so exercising itself now becomes the new obsession or compulsive behavior. And so we have to be mindful of that again, you may, if we talk about these things as a cure, we have to make sure that we don't introduce the idea of another compulsion. Right.
That's right. The treatment becomes is assumed as the next disorder. That's the next obsession. Now I have to exercise obsessively, and I've seen people do that. A roommate in college, he wanted to quit drinking beer, so he started drinking Manhattans. That was a good trade. Yeah. You're still probably drinking, right?
Probably tastes better.
So no, be careful of that. With OCD in particular, but I think it applies to depression, anxiety, and other disorders. Be careful that you don't get drawn into that trap of feeling like you should be able to do the treatment perfectly. Right. Okay. Sometimes, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, behavior therapy, ERP, no matter what it is, you're not going to use these strategies perfectly every time.
Absolutely.
Okay? And the other thing is, don't expect to be symptom-free. Right. You're still going to have, whether it's depression, anxiety, OCD, you're still going to have it. Some days are going to be better than others. Right. So you have to be able to manage these expectations. I used to listen to Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, and I never heard them say this, but they said, happiness is reality minus expectations. I love that. I might put it up in my office somewhere. So happiness is reality minus expectations. So we have to be careful about expectations.
Right.
Okay, about giving false hope. That's what you meant by false hope. You have to be able to manage these expectations. Don't expect to be symptom-free,
Right.
and don't expect for the strategy to work every time.
Absolutely.
Those are unrealistic expectations.
Right. It's always going to be work. It's like a relationship. There's
That's
always
right.
work to do.
That's right.
And the more that you work at it, the better you're going to be. The longer you work at it, the longer you're going to be well. But as soon as you stop the work,
That's right.
you know, you're at risk for recurring.
That's right. We discovered that with reading disabilities years ago. Back in the 70s, Martha Dankla was a neurologist at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
And she said, as long as we continued the reading tutoring,
Right.
the students continued to make gains. As soon as the tutoring stopped, the gains
Right.
reduced. And I think it's the same with these mental disorders,
Yeah.
is you have to keep working at them.
Yeah.
You're not going to cure it. You're not going to be completely symptom-free.
Right.
It's something you just have to work at.
Absolutely.
Okay. Most of us are working on something.
Yeah.
So don't feel that you're the only one struggling.
Absolutely. So, all right, that then is it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.